She'll need your process notes by Friday, Greg said while stirring powdered creamer into burnt conference room coffee. And try not to overwhelm her with too much operational detail at once. Operational detail. That was an interesting phrase for the system that kept 214 retail distribution sites from quietly collapsing into inventory fraud and shipping chaos. Across the table, the woman replacing me smiled nervously and opened a brand new leather notebook she probably bought that morning. Greg glanced at me again. We really want this transition to feel positive. I looked at the stack of binders in front of her. 12 years of regional logistics infrastructure condensed into color-coded tabs and undocumented instincts. Then I looked at Greg. And for the first time in that meeting, I almost felt bad for him. If you enjoy stories where quiet competence finally cashes the check, hit like and subscribe. Some people spend years building systems. Other people mistake those systems for luck. My name was Natalie Mercer. I was 49 years old, and for 12 years I ran regional operations for Leland Distribution Group. Officially, my title was Regional Operations Director for Midwestern Strategic Accounts, which sounded harmless. Corporate titles are usually designed to hide how much pressure sits underneath them. What I actually controlled was the fulfillment infrastructure for the company's single largest revenue relationship, the Hartwell Retail Consortium. 214 stores across 9 states. 4.2 million square feet of inventory movement per month. Average quarterly revenue, $86 million. Every product movement flowed through a vendor coordination matrix I built myself over 8 years. Not because anyone asked me to. Because the original system nearly destroyed the account during a winter freight collapse in my 3rd year. That's how most important systems get built in corporate America. Not through innovation summits. Through panic. When I arrived at Leland, the Hartwell account was already considered high maintenance, which was executive language for nobody understands why this keeps failing. Late shipments. Phantom inventory. Vendor disputes. Dock congestion. Compliance penalties. The problems weren't dramatic individually. That was what made them dangerous. One missed pallet becomes 6. 6 become a regional shortage. Then suddenly someone in Minneapolis can't explain why patio furniture is sitting in Kansas while Ohio stores have empty floors during Memorial Day weekend. Retail logistics is basically organized anxiety with barcode scanners. I started at Leland when I was 37. Divorced. 1 teenage son. Working out of a beige office with humming fluorescent lights and carpet that smelled faintly like old rain whenever humidity rose. The company promoted me after I fixed a routing conflict nobody else wanted to touch. At the time, Hartwell's primary issue involved vendor synchronization failures between inbound freight carriers and regional warehouse release windows. Their software systems technically communicated with each other. Technically. In practice, the timing protocols were off by 11 minutes during overnight inventory reconciliation. 11 minutes. That's all it took. The warehouse management system closed inventory locks before freight confirmations completed, which caused phantom shortages every Tuesday and Thursday between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. 3 consulting firms missed it. I found it because I stayed late one night eating vending machine peanuts while watching timestamp logs line by line. That's operations work. You stare at invisible patterns until the machine finally tells you where it hurts. After that, people started calling me whenever something complicated broke. Natalie, can you look at this? Natalie, can you jump on a call? Natalie, Hartwell's escalating again. I became the person standing quietly between the company and expensive embarrassment. Over time, I built systems nobody formally approved because formal approval usually took 6 committees and 4 months. So I solved things first and documented them later. I created dynamic vendor escalation trees based on seasonal freight pressure. I redesigned shipment sequencing around regional labor shortages. I negotiated direct communication access with Hartwell's internal procurement analysts, bypassing 3 useless reporting layers that slowed every correction by 48 hours. Most importantly, I built the vendor continuity matrix. That was the weapon. Though nobody at Leland understood it at the time. Officially, the matrix was a relationship management framework coordinating vendor prioritization, emergency routing authority, compliance waivers, and fulfillment sequencing for high-volume retail accounts. Unofficially, it was the nervous system holding the Hartwell contract together. The system mapped every operational dependency between Hartwell and its top 37 supply vendors. Shipping behavior, penalty thresholds, escalation triggers, alternative routing rights, inventory substitution tolerances, emergency release authorizations. But the real value wasn't the software. It was the relationships embedded inside it. Because over 12 years, I became the trusted operational contact for almost every critical vendor attached to Hartwell's network. People answered my calls. That matters more than executives realize, especially during supply chain disruptions. I knew which warehouse directors panicked under pressure and which ones solved problems quietly at 3 a.m. I knew which freight carriers inflated weather delays and which procurement officers quietly adjusted compliance windows when they trusted you. I knew which inventory managers needed spreadsheets and which needed 5 calm sentences and a solution before sunrise. The matrix wasn't just data. It was behavioral infrastructure. And it existed almost entirely because I built it manually over years of accumulated trust. Every vendor override authority flowed through my authentication credentials. Every emergency allocation request required my approval chain because Hartwell authorized expedited exceptions exclusively through certified regional operational contacts. Me, not Leland. That distinction would matter later. The culture at Leland before Greg arrived was imperfect but functional. Executives mostly left operations alone because operations consistently saved them from disaster. Our department occupied the 4th floor. Gray cubicles. Constant coffee smell. Phones ringing from 6 a.m. until dinner. The people there were competent in the unglamorous way corporations quietly depend on. Martha in compliance could identify fraudulent freight invoices from formatting inconsistencies alone. Daniel in routing could mentally calculate fuel-adjusted transit windows faster than most software. Carol from vendor management once prevented a $4.8 million seasonal inventory collapse because she noticed a typo in a refrigerated freight authorization. Nobody celebrated these things. That's the strange part. Corporate America survives almost entirely because invisible people keep noticing problems before executives do. I liked my work because it rewarded steadiness. No theatrics. No motivational speeches. Just systems functioning correctly. Then Greg Ellison arrived, Vice President of Operational Transformation, which sounded like a job invented during a branding retreat. Greg was 34, tall, expensive gym membership shoulders, white sneakers polished so clean they reflected conference room lights. He wore fitted quarter zips instead of suits because younger executives think dressing like a startup founder automatically makes spreadsheets more innovative. He spoke in presentation cadence. Every sentence sounded pre-approved by consultants. We need to rethink operational agility. Legacy structures create inefficiency drag. Modern organizations prioritize scalable adaptability. Nobody in operations trusted him immediately because nobody who actually solves logistical problems says things like efficiency drag with confidence. Greg came from corporate strategy, not operations. Very important distinction. Corporate strategy people believe systems are made of diagrams. Operations people know systems are made of exhausted humans compensating for reality in real time. His first week, Greg scheduled individual assessment meetings with department leadership. Mine lasted 27 minutes. He spent 18 of them asking why my vendor continuity permissions weren't more democratized. Interesting phrasing. What exactly concerns you? I asked. He leaned back in his chair. You've centralized a lot of mission-critical communication around yourself. Around myself. Like I'd built a throne instead of a functioning supply chain. It reduces response time, I said. But it creates dependency. No. Competence created dependency. The company just confused that with structure. Greg continued reviewing spreadsheets on his tablet. We want operations to feel more transferable. Transferable. Another interesting word. I watched him carefully then. He had the kind of confidence people develop when every previous mistake got reframed as leadership potential. Over the next 2 months, he launched what he called the Operational Modernization Initiative. Nobody on the fourth floor called it that. We called it Greg rearranging furniture. He introduced performance dashboards measuring metrics nobody in logistics cared about. Average meeting efficiency, cross-functional engagement scores, workflow sentiment indexing. Meanwhile, actual operational problems still landed on my desk. Because reality doesn't care about PowerPoint. During week 6, Hartwell experienced a vendor bottleneck involving delayed patio inventory shipments entering the St. Louis distribution region. Greg scheduled a strategy workshop. I solved the issue in 43 minutes by rerouting 2 overflow carriers through Indianapolis and temporarily modifying receiving windows with a warehouse manager I'd worked with for 9 years. Afterward, Greg congratulated the department on leveraging collaborative energy. I remember staring at him while microwaved popcorn smell drifted through the office kitchen and thinking he genuinely believed the workshop solved the problem. That was the dangerous part. He wasn't malicious, just insulated from consequences. Then came the restructuring meeting. Thursday morning. Cold rain against the windows. Conference room smelled like dry erase markers and stale coffee. HR attended, which tells you almost everything immediately. Greg folded his hands on the table and smiled carefully. Natalie, after reviewing department structure, we've decided to evolve the regional operations role into a more streamlined management model. Evolve. Corporate language always sounds like someone trying to terminate you politely through vocabulary. Beside him sat Melissa Kane, 32. Blonde highlights. Sharp blazer. New MBA from Northwestern. Very polished. Very eager. Very unaware. She smiled when I entered the room because she still thought this was a promotion story. Greg continued. Melissa will transition into the new senior operations lead role over the next 30 days. Transition. Interesting. Not replace. They always soften the verbs when they know they're doing something short-sighted. I looked at Melissa. She looked back with the nervous excitement of someone boarding a plane without realizing the pilot just quit. We'd really value your help during the knowledge transfer process, Greg said. Knowledge transfer. Another phrase executives use when they think expertise exists in folders. What exactly would I transfer? I asked. Greg smiled politely. The operational framework. There it was again. Framework. As if the Hartwell account functioned because of organizational charts instead of years of negotiated trust and undocumented escalation authority. Melissa finally spoke. I've heard amazing things about your systems. Systems. Plural. Interesting choice. Because from their perspective, the systems belong to Leland. What they didn't understand was the Hartwell vendor continuity matrix operated through relationship-linked authorization credentials assigned specifically to me as Certified Vendor Escalation Director. Hartwell approved the structure after a freight litigation dispute in year 5. Every emergency override authority flowed through my authenticated operational designation. Mine, not the company's. Greg slid a folder toward me. Severance package. Transition schedule. Retention bonus if I completed all 30 days. That last part almost made me laugh. They thought I might sabotage something. I wouldn't. Sabotage is emotional. I preferred consequences. So I signed the transition agreement. Greg visibly relaxed. People always relax too early around calm women. The next 30 days became strangely educational. Mostly for me. Melissa shadowed me everywhere carrying that leather notebook and asking careful questions. At first, I expected arrogance. Instead, she was earnest. Which honestly made the whole thing more depressing. This wasn't a villain replacing me. This was a younger employee being handed a machine nobody explained to her. I trained her properly anyway. How to prioritize vendor escalation by shipment category. How to identify fake weather delay documentation. Which warehouse directors needed calls instead of emails. Which Hartwell procurement managers hated surprises more than mistakes. I showed her how the continuity matrix handled seasonal pressure balancing between regional carriers. I explained emergency allocation sequencing. I taught her how to read freight variance reports the way mechanics listen to engines. Not just numbers. Patterns. She learned quickly too. That mattered later. One afternoon during week 2, Melissa asked an honest question. Can I ask something weird? Usually. She lowered her voice. Why does everyone CC you on things that don't technically require your approval? I leaned back in my chair. Because finally someone noticed. They don't trust systems during emergencies, I said. They trust outcomes. She frowned slightly. But the process documentation exists. Yes. Then why? Because documentation explains procedure, not judgment. That stayed with her. I could tell. Meanwhile, Greg kept restructuring things. He consolidated vendor communication channels into centralized ticket systems. Terrible idea. Ticket systems work for predictable issues. Supply chains are mostly unpredictable issues happening simultaneously. Then he reduced emergency response authority thresholds because he believed empowered teams make faster decisions. Which sounds wonderful until empowered teams accidentally approve $900,000 in unnecessary expedited freight charges during a regional inventory scare. That happened in week 3. Greg blamed communication inefficiencies. Naturally. People like Greg always assume the system failed because they can't imagine they misunderstood it. Still, I kept training Melissa professionally. No bitterness. No hidden traps. No withheld information. That part surprises people. But revenge built on sabotage feels unstable. Amateurish. I wanted something cleaner. Besides, the real weapon wasn't information. It was position. Specifically, who controlled trust inside the vendor ecosystem attached to Hartwell. And Greg never understood that trust behaves like infrastructure. You only notice it after removing the load-bearing sections. Around day 21, Melissa started looking exhausted. Not incompetent. Overwhelmed. Important distinction. She stayed late every night reviewing escalation logs and continuity reports. I noticed her eating vending machine almonds for dinner twice in 1 week. One evening, she stopped beside my office holding 3 folders against her chest. How long did it take before all this felt manageable? I considered the question honestly. It never does, I said. She laughed quietly. I continued typing for a few seconds before adding, you just get faster at recognizing which disasters are real. That was probably the moment she understood the role wasn't administrative. It was protective. During the final week, Greg scheduled a transition presentation for senior leadership. Melissa presented operational improvement plans using slides Greg clearly helped prepare. Streamlined communication architecture. Scalable vendor engagement. Reduced dependency concentrations. I sat quietly near the back while executives nodded at colorful charts. Then one board member asked Melissa a simple question. What happens during a regional freight freeze if Hartwell invokes emergency continuity clauses simultaneously across multiple vendors? Melissa paused. Not long, but long enough. She looked toward me instinctively before catching herself. Greg jumped in immediately. Our updated escalation framework distributes responsibility more evenly. That wasn't an answer. The board member noticed. So did Melissa. After the meeting, she found me in the hallway. You knew he didn't answer that. Yes. Why didn't you say anything? I looked through the glass wall into the conference room where Greg laughed confidently beside people who confused fluency with expertise. Because he wasn't asking for help, I said. Day 30 arrived on a Friday. The office smelled like printer toner and catered sandwiches nobody really wanted. HR brought cupcakes. Corporate America loves dessert during terminations. Makes everyone feel less guilty. Melissa gave me a handwritten thank you card. Actual handwriting. I respected that. Greg shook my hand near the elevators. I think this transition went really well, he said. Of course he did. From his perspective, everything worked perfectly. Lower salary. Younger employee. Operational continuity. Clean numbers on a spreadsheet. What are your plans now? He asked casually. I almost told him the truth. Instead, I smiled politely. I'm taking the weekend first. At 4:42 p.m., I carried a single cardboard box to my car. Coffee mug. Framed photo of my son. 2 notebooks. 1 desk plant someone forgot I owned. 12 years condensed into 11 pounds of personal belongings. Interesting ratio. I sat in my car while rain tapped softly against the windshield. Then I opened my phone and sent 1 email. Recipient, Daniel Reyes. Former colleague. Current Senior Vice President at Meridian Logistics Solutions. For 2 years, Daniel had tried recruiting me. I always declined because loyalty becomes habit after enough years. The email contained one sentence. "Still interested?" He called before I reached the highway. "Natalie," he said immediately, "tell me this means what I think it means." "It probably does. When can we meet?" "Monday." Daniel laughed softly. "I've had an offer package prepared for 18 months. That part didn't surprise me. Competent people quietly track other competent people. Monday morning, I walked into Meridian's headquarters overlooking the riverfront downtown. Glass walls. Actual natural light. Coffee that didn't taste like burned regret. Daniel met me personally in the lobby. Older now. Gray at the temples. Same sharp eyes. "You look relaxed," he said. "I slept through Sunday night for the first time in 7 years." He grinned. Then he handed me the offer. Executive Vice President of Strategic Vendor Operations. Base salary 42% higher than Leland. Performance equity. Direct oversight of national retail continuity partnerships. Then I saw the detail that mattered. Primary account oversight. Hartwell Retail Consortium. Interesting. Very interesting. Meridian wasn't Leland's direct competitor overall. They were something much more dangerous. They controlled vendor fulfillment infrastructure supporting Hartwell's highest volume seasonal contracts. Meaning Meridian managed the back-end supply network Leland depended on to service the Hartwell account successfully. Daniel watched my expression carefully. "You see it now." "Yes. We've been expanding the partnership quietly for 2 years. And the renewal? 6 months. There it was. The weapon activating. Not revenge. Leverage. Because once I joined Meridian, I would oversee vendor continuity scoring tied directly to Hartwell's upcoming contract renewal evaluations. And Leland's operational performance metrics would become part of my review authority. They thought they replaced an operations director. What they didn't know was they had just transferred 12 years of relationship trust directly into the ecosystem, evaluating their largest client contract. I accepted before lunch. The first month at Meridian felt strange. Quieter. Sharper. More competent. Nobody interrupted operational briefings with motivational vocabulary. People spoke in specifics. Transit percentages. Vendor variance. Compliance exposure. I liked them immediately. Daniel gave me full authority over Hartwell continuity optimization, which meant every vendor escalation pathway I spent years building now flowed through my department from the opposite side of the table. Not secretly. Not illegally. Simply structurally. By month 2, vendors started calling me again. Not because I asked them to. Because relationships follow reliability. "Glad you're overseeing this now. Things got strange over there after you left. Whoever replaced you keeps escalating minor issues through the wrong channels." That last one came from a warehouse director in Ohio. I knew exactly which issue he meant. Melissa had started relying too heavily on centralized ticket routing because Greg pushed compliance visibility metrics aggressively, which slowed emergency approvals by 6 to 9 hours during active inventory spikes. Enough to hurt. Not enough to collapse. Yet, meanwhile, Leland began missing smaller continuity targets tied to Hartwell service benchmarks. 2% here. 4% there. Individually survivable. Collectively dangerous. The first major crack appeared during back-to-school inventory season. Hartwell required emergency rerouting for delayed appliance shipments entering the Illinois region after rail congestion disrupted normal freight sequencing. Under the old structure, I would have solved it within an hour through direct carrier negotiation. Instead, Melissa followed Greg's updated escalation protocol. 3 approval chains. 2 ticketing layers. 1 compliance verification delay. Total response time, 19 hours. Hartwell stores experienced regional shortages for 3 days. The client wasn't furious publicly. Worse, they became quiet. Experienced operations people fear quiet clients more than angry ones. Angry means they still expect improvement. Quiet means they're evaluating alternatives. By month 4, Meridian's vendor performance numbers surpassed Leland's in every measurable category tied to Hartwell fulfillment support. On-time seasonal delivery. Emergency response intervals. Inventory continuity stability. Daniel called me into his office one afternoon overlooking the river. Rain streaked softly against the windows. Hartwell wants expanded strategic review meetings next quarter. Meaning, they're reassessing primary operational partnerships. There it was. The beginning. Meanwhile, things at Leland kept deteriorating in very specific ways. Not catastrophically. Professionally. Greg introduced a new AI-assisted vendor prioritization dashboard during month 5. The system optimized freight allocation based on historical efficiency metrics. Wonderful in theory. Except historical efficiency metrics don't account for human behavior during supply shortages. The dashboard deprioritized 2 legacy vendors with lower profitability scores. Both vendors controlled emergency overflow inventory for Hartwell's winter heating product line. One cold snap later, Hartwell experienced stock failures across 43 stores. Melissa tried fixing it manually. Too late. Emergency freight costs exploded. Client penalties activated. Vendor trust eroded further. I heard about most of this indirectly. Operations people talk. Vendors talk more. One evening, Martha from compliance called me privately. "How bad is it over there?" I asked. Silence first. Then a tired laugh. Greg thinks the issue is morale. Of course he did. People like Greg always interpret structural failure emotionally because they don't understand mechanics. Then Martha said something interesting. "Melissa's trying." I know. She keeps defending the old systems in meetings now. That surprised me slightly. Not because she understood everything. Because she finally understood enough. 2 weeks later, Hartwell formally announced operational review proceedings for the regional distribution contract. Leland executives panicked immediately. Publicly, they called it a routine reassessment. Internally, emergency meetings started appearing across calendars at midnight. I know because 3 former coworkers texted me screenshots. Then came the moment Greg finally understood what happened. Hartwell scheduled the renewal oversight conference at Meridian headquarters. Not Leland's. Meridian's. Because Meridian now controlled the highest performing continuity infrastructure within the vendor ecosystem. And I chaired the operational review board. The meeting took place on a gray Tuesday morning in October. Cold air outside. Fresh coffee inside. Conference room overlooking the river. I wore a charcoal suit and reviewed continuity reports while Hartwell executives organized binders near the far end of the table. At 8:57 a.m., Greg entered. He stopped walking for half a second when he saw me at the head of the room. Interesting moment. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. Just the exact expression people make when the math finally becomes visible. Melissa entered behind him carrying folders against her chest. She looked exhausted. Greg recovered quickly because executives like him confuse composure with control. "Natalie," he said carefully. "Greg." Nobody shook hands. Hartwell's senior procurement officer, Elaine Porter, entered moments later. Elaine was one of the smartest client managers I'd ever worked with. Mid-50s. Silver-framed glasses. Voice like a paper cutter. Direct. Precise. Dangerous. She sat beside me and opened the review packet. Let's begin. The next 3 hours felt less like a meeting and more like an autopsy. Service variance failures. Emergency response delays. Continuity scoring declines. Vendor confidence deterioration. Every metric told the same story. Leland's systems no longer adapted under pressure. Greg tried explaining the restructuring strategy repeatedly. Operational modernization requires transitional flexibility. Elaine interrupted him without looking up. Your back-to-school shortages cost us $6.2 million. Silence. Greg shifted slightly. We've implemented corrective alignment measures. Elaine turned a page. You also triggered 14 vendor escalation complaints in 1 quarter. Melissa finally spoke then. Quietly. Some of those were caused by delayed approval structures. Greg looked at her sharply. Interesting. Because panic changes alliances too. Elaine continued reviewing reports. Then she asked the question that ended the meeting. Who designed your original continuity framework? Greg hesitated. Melissa answered first. Natalie did. Elaine looked at me. I thought so. There are moments in corporate life where entire power structures change direction silently. That was one of them. Elaine closed the binder. Since Ms. Mercer transitioned to Meridian, your continuity metrics improved 31% on this side and declined 22% on yours. Nobody spoke. Outside, rain moved slowly across the river in gray sheets. Greg tried once more. We believe our modernization efforts simply require more time. Elaine leaned back in her chair. You replaced operational resilience with reporting architecture. That sentence hit him harder than yelling would have. Because it was accurate. Then she looked at me. Can Meridian absorb expanded fulfillment oversight if we restructure the primary contract? I answered calmly. Yes. Greg finally lost composure then. Not loudly. Worse. Desperately. Natalie, he said, turning toward me, you know how complicated this account is. You know what transition risk would look like. Interesting wording. Now he believed in transition risk. I folded my hands. I do. And? I held his gaze for several seconds. That's why we built actual continuity systems. Silence again. Melissa stared down at her notes. Elaine made 3 additional comments about vendor confidence deterioration and operational governance failures. Then Hartwell adjourned the meeting. Official decision pending. But everyone already knew. 3 weeks later, Hartwell reduced Leland's contract scope by 68%. Meridian absorbed the majority of strategic operational oversight responsibilities. Leland lost $94 million in projected annual revenue. Stock analysts described it as a preventable continuity failure driven by leadership miscalculation. Greg resigned 2 months later. Officially 4 strategic realignment opportunities. Corporate language remains hilarious during collapse. Melissa stayed. That part mattered to me. Because unlike Greg, she learned. Last I heard, she rebuilt portions of the operational structure using some of the old escalation principles I taught her. Quietly too. Interesting how competence eventually reasserts itself once performance becomes measurable again. The permanent damage to Leland went far beyond revenue. 3 national vendors terminated preferred response agreements. Hartwell imposed external operational audits for 18 months. Shareholders filed governance complaints regarding restructuring oversight failures. The irony was almost mathematical. They eliminated my role to save $140,000 annually. The fallout exceeded $120 million within a year. All because executives saw stable systems and assumed stability was automatic. That happens constantly in corporations. Nobody notices the person holding pressure together until the pressure starts moving on its own. 2 years later, my office at Meridian overlooked a different river. Bigger team now. Better systems. Smarter leadership. I managed national continuity partnerships across 6 major retail accounts and spent most mornings solving complicated logistical problems with people who actually respected operational expertise. The work felt lighter there. Not easier. Just cleaner. One Thursday afternoon, Daniel forwarded me an industry article. Leland Distribution continues multi-year recovery after Hartwell losses. Buried halfway through the article was a sentence mentioning Meridian's stabilizing leadership under veteran continuity executive Natalie Mercer. No dramatic praise. No apology. Just acknowledgement. Which honestly felt more satisfying. That evening I stayed late reviewing winter allocation forecasts while the city lights reflected against the glass outside my office. Phones buzzed softly. Keyboards clicked. Operations teams moved calmly through problems instead of pretending problems shouldn't exist. My assistant knocked lightly on the open door. You heading home soon? In a minute. She smiled. Everything stable? I looked at the live continuity dashboard across my monitor. Green indicators. Balanced freight flow. No emergency escalation alerts. For once, yes. Stable enough, I said. And that was the thing nobody at Leland understood until it was too late. The goal was never to become irreplaceable. The goal was to become reliable enough that entire systems quietly relaxed around you. Remove that person carelessly, and eventually the machine remembers gravity. If you've ever trained someone to replace you while management congratulated themselves too early, leave a comment. And if you enjoy these stories about workplace justice and quiet competence winning in the end, like and subscribe. Somewhere tonight, another executive is mistaking stability for simplicity.